Nothing on earth happens purely by accident. A person is living because he was meant to live, and he has talents and abilities that are totally his own, or her own, unique with him or her. His job then as a person is to learn to know himself. If he does, he will like himself, for he will discover he's quite a person after all. He will recognize and accept the things he cannot do as well as some other people, but he'll also understand and appreciate those things it's been given him to do well. He will accept himself for what he really is, one of a kind, as different from every other person on earth as his fingerprints or his signature. Imagine that you're seated in a theater looking at the curtain which hides the blank screen as you wait for the feature picture to begin. What will this picture do for you? How will it affect you? What impact will it have on your life? Will you feel moved, perhaps even to tears? Will you laugh at a comedy or feel terrified at the crises faced by the hero or heroine? Will you feel wonderful waves of love and compassion or surges of resentment? All these feelings will pulse through you and more. For the picture you will see is about the most fascinating person in the world, yourself. In this theater, which is in the mind and heart of each of us, you are the producer, director, writer, actor or actress, hero, and the villain. You are the film technician up in the booth, and the audience which reacts to this thrilling drama. The exciting story unfolding upon this inner screen is one which is invented every second of your life, yesterday, tomorrow, but most important, right now. You watch the image upon that screen, and you invent the image upon that screen right now. Will the story have a happy ending? Is it full of happiness and success, or sorrow and failure? The storyline is already there, and the discerning eye can tell the direction in which the story will go. But one realization can comfort you. Since you are the dramatist, the director, and the actor, you can change the story as it unfolds, now, this instant, and for your whole lifetime. It seems that you can make this a success story. You can be the hero and conquer the villain. You can make this a heartwarming story which will enrich the lives of all who know you, rather than a drab mechanical tale, a chronicle of boredom. It's all inside you. It all depends on what you do with an image you carry inside you, an image which is your most important tool for good or for ill. It all depends on you and your self-image. The self-image is your own conception of the sort of person you are. It's a product of past experiences, successes and failures, humiliations and triumphs, and the way other people react to you, especially in early childhood. From these factors and from others, you build up a picture of yourself which you believe is true. The picture may be false, and in many cases is false, but the important fact here is that you act just as if it were true. For all intents and purposes, it is true. If it's a good, healthy, successful self-image, fine, but if it can stand some improvement, you can change it for the better and start getting the kind of results such a change will bring about. Our thoughts, habits, even our abilities must be those of the person we believe ourselves to be. We can set new limits in place of old ones, but we can't surpass the limits of our current self-image. There's a story about a Wisconsin farmer who was walking through his fields one day when he stumbled over a little glass jug in his pumpkin patch. Out of curiosity, he poked a young pumpkin through the neck of the jug, being careful not to break the vine. Then he placed his little experiment back on the ground and walked away. When harvest time came, the farmer was working his way down a row of big ripe pumpkins when he again came upon the glass jug. But this time it looked different. Picking it up, he discovered that the young pumpkin he'd poked inside now completely filled its glass prison. Having no more room, it had stopped growing. The farmer broke the jug and held in his hand a runt pumpkin, less than half the size of all the other pumpkins and exactly the shape of the jug. Well, people aren't pumpkins, but our self-image is something like that jug. It determines the size and kind of person we become. The similarity ends with the fact that we can remove our self-imposed limitations by enlarging our self-image. We form a mental picture of ourselves through experience, and we can change that picture the same way, through experience. If the actual experience we need is not available to us, we can, according to self-image psychology, create that experience synthetically. Now, scientists agree that the human nervous system is incapable of distinguishing between actual experience and the same experience imagined vividly and in complete detail. Worry is a good example of this synthetic experience. When a person worries about something, he projects himself mentally, emotionally, even physically, into a situation that hasn't even occurred. The man who worries intensely about, well, say, failure, finds himself experiencing the same reactions that accompany actual failure, feelings of anxiety, inadequacy, and humiliation, and eventually headaches and an upset stomach. As far as his mind and body are concerned, he has failed. And if he worries about it long enough, if he concentrates on failure intensely enough, he will upset himself to the extent that he will fail, and he'll get sick. Now, everything can be used in either of two ways, positively or negatively, constructively or destructively. Worry is the negative use of creative imagination. It's a negative synthetic experience. But most people apparently never realize that positive results, just as real as the negative results of worry, can be achieved through using our imagination constructively. The man who worries about failure is unwittingly defeating himself. He's feeding his mind the wrong data. If he spent the same amount of time visualizing success as he spends thinking about failure, he could reverse the process of synthetic experience. Instead of anxiety, he could develop confidence, self-assurance, poise, and a feeling of well-being would replace apprehension. By concentrating on the success he desires, by synthetically experiencing that success, he can expand his self-image into that of a person for whom success is normal, expected. Why not practice holding the self-image of the person you most want to become? This is the person you can become. Use your spare moments to concentrate on your goals and the greater success you seek. Analyze your past successes and formulate ways your success can be increased in the future. Put more into the positive use of your imagination than you ever put into its negative use, worry. You're merely reversing the same creative process. Now it's working for you instead of against you. Nobody pokes us into glass prisons beyond which we can't grow, but all too often, almost unknowingly, we set unnecessary limits for ourselves by holding a self-image that's restricted, inadequate for the full realization of our potentialities. Each of us is, at this moment, the product of all his thoughts and experiences and environment up to this point. Through thought, we can control to an almost unbelievable degree both our experience and our environment from here on. Whether or not we choose to direct our own course through life is entirely up to us. The important thing is to know that it can be done. One time the late Dr. Maxwell Maltz, whom we called Uncle Max, dropped by my office for a chat and lunch. We got to talking on his favorite subject, namely how a person can come to grips with himself, develop a healthy self-image, and find freedom in the world. He told me he had discovered 4 important steps a person can take on a regular basis to form the new habits that can build a healthy, new self-image. And as he talked at lunch, I made notes on a scrap of paper. Here are his 4 points in the order in which he gave them to me. Number 1, forgive others with no strings attached. You must clean the slate absolutely. Forgive every person against whom you might hold some kind of grudge. Clean the slate. You do this for your own sake, your own peace of mind. We don't hurt others when we hold hatred toward them. We hurt ourselves. Seriously, it can lead to serious illness. So number 1, forgive others, all others. If you cannot take this first step, you can forget the rest. You haven't grown up yet. 2, forgive yourself. See yourself with kind eyes. Try to forget completely all the idiotic things you've done, the pain you've given to others, the embarrassments you've suffered, the mistakes you've made in the past. Forgive yourself. Wipe clean the slate. Look in the mirror, he said, and forgive yourself. Practice this, and you can actually pull it off. Now, it's not easy to forgive ourselves. We tend to be much tougher on ourselves than we are on others. But the fact is, blame doesn't help. It's a destructive emotion. See yourself with kind eyes. That's number 2. Number 3, see yourself at your best. As Dr. Maltz put it, we can start the day in frustration or confidence. Take your pick. Now, the intelligent thing to do is to pick confidence, if it's at all possible. There are bad days, but it's better to begin the day in a confident mood than in a mood of frustration. And number 4, keep up with yourself. Don't worry about what others are doing or what others have done or have. Keep your pace. It's different from the pace of others. It's faster than some. It's slower than others. Forget the Joneses, and don't feel guilty about moving ahead of some of your contemporaries. The person who deliberately holds himself down to a slower pace just to be one of the gang is a fool. Keep up with yourself. Live the life you want to live. Earn what you want to earn in serving others, and do what you want to do. Live your own life, and don't be too concerned about how others are living theirs. 4 steps to a healthy self-image. 1. Forgive others. 2. Forgive yourself. 3. See yourself at your best. Choose confidence instead of frustration. And 4. Keep up with yourself. March to your own drummer, and don't worry about what others are doing. You know, the words "know thyself" are still 2 of the most important words ever put together. You know why people sometimes, quite often as a matter of fact, have inferiority complexes? It's because their thinking is based on a false premise. The false premise is that they compare themselves to other people. Well, this is actually something they should never do, since no 2 human beings are alike. Everybody on Earth is inferior to everyone else on Earth in certain areas, and superior in other areas. This is why the well-adjusted person, the person who knows himself, isn't bothered because he can't dance as well as so-and-so or play golf or bridge as well as someone else. It would be completely impossible for any one human being to be as good at everything as every other human being. In his fine book, Psycho-Cybernetics, Dr. Maxwell Maltz wrote, "Inferiority and superiority are reverse sides of the same coin. The cure lies in realizing that the coin itself is spurious. You are not inferior or are not superior. You are simply you. You as a personality are not in competition with any other personality simply because there's not another person on the face of the earth like you, or in your particular class. You're an individual. You are unique. You are not like any other person. You're not supposed to be like any other person, and no other person is supposed to be like you." The doctor went on to write, "God did not create a standard person and in some way label that person by saying, 'This is it.' He made every human being individual and unique, just as he made every snowflake individual and unique. God created short people and tall people," Dr. Maxwell Maltz wrote, "large people and small people, skinny people and fat people, black, yellow, red, and white people. He's never indicated any preference for any one size, shape, or color. Abraham Lincoln once said, 'God must have loved the common people, for he made so many of them.' He was wrong. There is no common man, no standardized common pattern. He would have been near the truth had he said, 'God must have loved uncommon people, for he made so many of them.' Anybody could make himself feel inferior if he didn't realize that he's unlike any other human being who ever lived on Earth. If he understands fully and completely, intellectually and emotionally, that he is a unique and different individual, he cannot have an inferiority complex. How could he? Since there's no standard against which to judge if every person is different, and every person is different, man and woman. Nothing on Earth happens purely by accident. A person is living because he was meant to live, and he has talents and abilities that are totally his own, or her own, unique with him or her. His job then as a person is to learn to know himself. If he does, he will like himself, for he will discover he's quite a person after all. He will recognize and accept the things he cannot do as well as some other people, but he'll also understand and appreciate those things it's been given him to do well. He will accept himself for what he really is, one of a kind, as different from every other person on Earth as his fingerprints or his signature. A human being is the finest, the noblest, the most godlike creature ever produced on Earth. Not to be thankful for such a gift is the worst kind of ignorance, and an inferiority complex is a phantom, a ghost with no real substance. In the light of knowledge, it disappears. Of all the traps and pitfalls in life, self-disesteem is the deadliest and the hardest to overcome, for it is a pit designed and dug by our own hands, summed up in the phrase, "It's no use, I can't do it." The penalty of succumbing to it is heavy, both for the individual in terms of material rewards lost and for society in gains and progress unachieved. On those days when we're most subject to fearful unbelief in ourselves, when we most doubt ourselves and feel inadequate to our task, isn't it precisely then that we're most difficult to get along with? We simply must get it through our heads that holding a low opinion of ourselves is not a virtue, but a vice. Jealousy, for example, which is the scourge of many a marriage, is nearly always caused by self-doubt. The person with adequate self-esteem doesn't feel hostile toward others. He isn't out to prove anything. He can see the facts more clearly, isn't as demanding in his claims on other people. The housewife who felt that a facelift might cause her husband and children to appreciate her more really needed to appreciate herself more. Middle age, plus a few wrinkles and a few gray hairs, had caused her to lose self-esteem. She then became supersensitive to innocent remarks and actions of her family. And so here's Dr. Maxwell Maltz's prescription for restoring your self-esteem. Stop carrying around a mental picture of yourself as a defeated, worthless person. Stop dramatizing yourself as an object of pity and injustice. You know, the word esteem literally means to appreciate the worth of. Why do men stand in awe of the stars and the moon, the immensity of the sea, the beauty of a flower or a sunset, and at the same time downgrade themselves? Did not the same Creator make man? Is not man himself the most marvelous creation of all? This appreciation of your own worth is not egotism unless you assume that you made yourself and should take the credit. Do not downgrade the product merely because you haven't used it correctly. Don't childishly blame the product for your own errors like the schoolboy who said, "This typewriter can't spell." But the biggest secret of self-esteem is this. Begin to appreciate other people more. Show respect for any human being merely because he's a child of God and therefore a thing of value. Stop and think when you're dealing with people. You're dealing with a unique, individual creation of the Creator of all. Practice treating other people as if they had some value, and surprisingly enough, your own self-esteem will go up. For real self-esteem is not derived from the great things you've done, the things you own, or the mark you've made, but an appreciation of yourself for what you are. If you're lacking in self-esteem, it's because you don't understand who or what you really are. If you'll take the time to learn more about yourself, you'll be delighted at what you discover. The self-esteem that comes from knowing we can be in charge of our own lives. I think this is what gives us self-esteem. All of a sudden we realize that, as the old poem has it, Invictus, I am captain of my fate, I am master of my soul. I'm in charge here, and this is wonderful. I think most people start out with a wonderful self-image. I think babies, little children start out just, so with it, so full of life and fun, and then they're ground down quite often by their environment and pushed into little rigid cubby holes into which they're forced to work and live, and they don't always come out of it all that well. People are individuals. There are no two human beings alike. The possibility of there being two human beings alike, the possibilities are so remote, so staggering that it probably has never happened and will never happen, except in the case of single-egg twins, I suppose. So a person is a single, original human creature. He is different in certain ways from all other human beings. Yet when he gets into kindergarten and into school, he's forced to be like all the other little kids. He has the same desk, he has the same pencils, does the same studies. He begins to be pushed into a part of a group. Now, it's important to work as a part of a team. It's important to be a good team worker. It's important to be a good team member. It's important to do your part in that kind of an arrangement. But he lives so much of that, and his mother tells him that you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do this. Good little boys don't do that. Good little girls don't do that. He is milled down to some extent until he begins to see himself, or she begins to see herself, as sort of an indistinguishable member of a large group of people that age. And then, of course, youngsters go through a time when it's very important that they be accepted by their peers, and so the most important thing they can do in the world is to become indistinguishable from their peers. They dress alike, they wear the same clothes. I did when I was in high school. We all did. I remember when my daughter used to spend a couple of hours working at getting so scuzzy in her dress, as she used to put it, so that her jeans would look so faded and her, everything would look so secondhand. If people knew how hard they worked to look so shabby, they wouldn't believe it. But she had to do that in order to fit into her group. And, of course, we go through that. Then in college, the same thing goes on. People in college are, again, fit into groups, and they get into things like social psychology and that, and they are, in many ways, socialized as persons. Quite often, the individual is lost sight of in all of this big, thick melange of things that goes on. And what someone needs to do is keep reminding them every day, hey, remember now, you're a distinct individual with distinct possibilities. And, of course, they don't do that. Lewis Mumford has written that the great mass of comfortable, well-fed people of our civilization live lives of emotional apathy and mental torpor. Lives of enfeebled desire, second-hand, derivative lives. And he said the Greeks had a word for this pallid simulacrum of real existence. They called it Hades. One of the fastest-growing groups in our society is the inner-directed now. They're really coming out of it. I think that's partly been responsible for the phenomenal growth of our corporation, because more people now are shaking off the old shibboleths. They're shaking off the old myths and stories, and they're saying, I'm going to do it, I'm going to make it, I'm going to really live this life, and in so doing, I'm going to render the greatest possible service. Sidney Harris began his strictly personal column back in 1943. He had a number of books published, all of which I think I own and enjoy. One of my favorite columns was one in which he told about walking with a friend of his to the newsstand. His friend bought a paper, thanking the vendor politely. The vendor didn't even acknowledge it. A sullen fellow, isn't he? Harris commented. Always that way every night, shrugged his friend. Then why do you continue being so polite to him? Sidney Harris asked. Why not? Inquired his friend. Why should I let him decide how I'm going to act? As Harris thought about the incident later, it occurred to him that the operating word was act. His friend acts toward people. Many of us react toward them. He has a sense of inner balance lacking in many of us frail and uncertain creatures. He knows who he is, what he stands for, and how he should behave. No boor is going to disturb the equilibrium of his nature. He simply refuses to return incivility with incivility, because then he'd no longer be in command of his own conduct, but a mere responder to others. When we're enjoined in the Bible to return good for evil, we look upon this as a moral injunction, which it is, but it's also a psychological prescription for our emotional health. Nobody is unhappier than the perpetual reactor. His center of emotional gravity is not rooted within himself, where it belongs, but in the world outside him. His spiritual temperature is always being raised or lowered by the social climate around him, and he's a mere creature at the mercy of these elements. Praise gives him a feeling of euphoria, which is false because it doesn't last and it doesn't come from self-approval. Criticism depresses him more than it should because it confirms his own secretly shaky opinion of himself. Snubs hurt him, and the merest suspicion of unpopularity in any quarter rouses him to bitterness or aggressiveness or querulousness. Only a saint, of course, never reacts, but a serenity of spirit cannot be achieved until we become the masters of our own actions and attitudes, and not merely reactors to other people's feelings. To let another determine whether we shall be rude or gracious, elated or depressed, is to relinquish control over our own personalities, which is ultimately all we possess. The only true possession is self-possession. A wise man once wrote, "To be human is to feel inferior. Did you know that there's probably not a human being alive who doesn't have feelings of inferiority? He or she may not be born with them, but such feelings are soon developed. Will Rogers said we're all ignorant only about different things, and it's also true that we are all inferior in different ways. The person with a healthy, happy attitude toward his or her world recognizes his or her inferiorities as a normal part of being human. The neurotic or unbalanced people hate themselves for their inferiorities. They feel they represent weaknesses and abnormalities when they really do nothing of the kind. Well-adjusted people frankly admire others for their talents and abilities without feeling envious. In fact, they don't even bring themselves into comparison at all. They're happily resigned to the fact that they're not the best-looking, best-built, smartest, most talented, fastest, cleverest, funniest, most engaging people on earth. Without even thinking about it, they seem to know that every person is a potpourri of strengths and weaknesses inherited from all of his ancestors. No two of them were alike, but each one has a slightly different strong point with the standard collection of weaknesses. If we have knobby knees or big feet or an off-kilter figure, or have to wear glasses or fail to cause people of the opposite sex to tear at our clothes as we walk down the street, or can't do complicated mathematical equations in our heads, we still represent that which we've been given. The most intelligent and healthy thing we can do about it is to make best use of what we do have, and what we have is considerable. The experts say that each of us has deep reservoirs of ability, even genius, that we habitually fail to make use of. We fail to make use of our own private and individual talents because we're caught up in the absurd and impossible game of trying to be like other people who could no more be like us than we could be like them. We forget that other people feel inferior too. Since there's no one else on earth just like us, how can we be inferior? We are, each of us, one of a kind, defying rigid comparison by any measuring stick. The next time you're in a room full of people, remember that every one of them feels inferior to some degree in many areas, just as you and I do. Consider your strong points. Be yourself, and join the human race. Try to concentrate on things that take your mind and your interest away from yourself. If you spend your life trying to match the strong points of others, you're doomed to a life of frustration and despair, and you never develop your own strong points. One day a few years back, I stopped my car for gas at a service station in Hollywood, California. While the middle-aged owner of the station cheerfully went about taking care of my car's needs, I noticed that while the station was by no means new, it was spotlessly clean. I was particularly surprised at the driveway. It was as clean as if my car were the first to use it. I asked the owner how in the world he managed to keep the driveway spotless with dozens of cars dripping oil and tracking the dirt of the highways on it. He told me how a common product sold at every supermarket was, in his estimation, the best driveway cleaner in the world. He beamed in response to my comment on the way he kept the place of business. It was a valuable moment for both of us. I learned something of value, and he experienced the pleasure of honest praise. The need for praise is basic to everyone. With it, a person blooms and grows. Without it, he tends to shrink and withdraw into himself. We all know children need constant praise and encouragement. When a child brings home a piece of artwork that looks for all the world like an unfortunate accident, he still expects an encouraging word, but his need for encouragement is no less than his mother's or father's. Far too many parents aren't getting any praise, or at least not nearly enough. Understanding the importance of self-esteem and seeing the never-ending need for reaffirmation of a person's worth, we should make it our business to watch for honest opportunities to give praise, especially to the members of our family and those with whom we work. There's a subtle but enormously valuable byproduct or backfire to this sort of thing. In order to praise others, we need to look for the good. It forces us to concentrate on what's right with people and the things they do rather than on what's wrong. It focuses our attention on the positive side of the ledger and, as a result, makes us happier, more productive, and more pleasant to be around. Then, too, people like those who praise them and recognize their value. When we give praise, we attract a larger circle of friends. And finally, giving praise is the best-known way to receive it. It's hard for anyone to compliment a chronic grouch. Whenever you hear someone say, "Nobody appreciates me, nobody gives me credit for all I do," the chances are he's so wrapped up in himself and in getting happiness from others, he's completely forgotten how to give. We should try to find some way to commend those we love every day. Praise to a human being represents what sunlight, water, and the soil are to a plant, the climate in which he grows best. He doesn't just want it, he needs it, as he needs the air he breathes. Molière said, "The most agreeable recompense which we can receive for things which we've done is to see them known, to have them applauded with praises which honor us." My father was a regular and avid reader of the old Zane Grey books. That's how I got hold of them, which invariably, or so it seemed, began with a stranger riding into town. He was tall, lean, always covered with alkali dust. Cool gray eyes peered evenly from under straight brows, and his hand hovered near the 6-gun strapped to his thigh. He had no friends or acquaintances, and seemed to like it that way. He was a man of few words, and kept his own counsel. His world consisted of little more than himself, his horse, and usually the bad guy he was after. Well, it makes a good story, and everyone seems to be intrigued by this sort of man of mystery. But in real life, it's a lonely way to live, especially since few of us have horses these days. You can't know too many people, and we'd all be better off if we could overcome our natural timidity where strangers are concerned, if we could open up more. As a friend of mine who has attained an unusually high position in the world says, "Open the doors and windows of your mind and heart to others, and you'll reap a wonderful harvest of friends." Many of us have a tendency to speak or smile only after another person has spoken or smiled at us first. We tend to be reactors instead of actors. It reminds me of the person who sat in front of the cold stove and said, "Give me heat, and then I'll add the wood." The world just doesn't work that way. With a little effort, a person can form the habit of smiling and saying hello first. 19 times out of 20, you'll get a favorable response. I know a man who was a foreign representative for an American electronics firm. He was something of an introvert, and on his frequent flights all over the world, he'd bury himself in a book to keep from having to talk to the passenger next to him. On one trip, a friendly Englishman managed to get a conversation started with him, and it turned out the Englishman was on an electronics buying trip to the States, and a large order resulted. Then and there, he decided to change his attitude toward strangers. While it may not result in another business deal, he's meeting all sorts of interesting people and making many new friends. We should never say, "He's not my kind of person," or "That's not my sort of crowd." Whenever there's a human being, there's a human story, and it's invariably interesting and informative. It stretches our minds, broadens our horizons, and adds to our collection of acquaintances and friends. And all it takes is a smile, the word hello, and a comment or two to get a conversation going. The chances are that the other person is as anxious to add to his collection of friends as we are. But he or she may be just a little on the timid side, as many people are in the presence of strangers. It's true, you can't know too many people, and as we grow older, we should cultivate all the friends we can. The person who shuts others out of his life ends up shutting himself in. Try my friend's advice. Throw open the doors and windows of your mind and heart to others and reap a harvest of friends. Who wants to live with a horse?
Anyone who has ever been called upon to perform before a crowd is familiar with one of the most exquisitely terrifying experiences known to man. It's called stage fright. It, like other fears, must be faced to be conquered. There's simply no other way to whip it, if indeed it ever can be completely whipped. Every actor knows the steel-fingered hand that closes like a giant claw on his vitals during the 30 seconds before the scene begins. Every person who's ever made a speech to a large gathering knows the shadow of fear that stands with him in the wings, the dry mouth, the trembling hands, the quaking in the stomach, and the trembling at the knees. And there's only one logical thing to do. You simply dive in and start swimming. The next time won't be quite so bad, but it'll be very bad for many, many times. I read a little article in Success Unlimited magazine written by Marjorie B. Nagel called The Big Me Within Us, and the story is told that on opening night, before the great Enrico Caruso became famous, he was overcome by stage fright, and as he stood in the wings, his throat contracted with a spasm of terror. Sweat poured from him, and he was on the verge of running away. Suddenly, a thought struck him. He thought to himself, the little me on the outside is strangling the big me on the inside. The me that wants to sing, that can sing, must come out. And then Caruso began a kind of whispered shout. The audience couldn't hear him, but it frightened the other members of the cast and the stagehands. He said in a loud whisper, "Get out of the way! Get out! Get out!" Naturally, they'd all thought he'd snapped, and they didn't know what he was going to do. By the time the cue came for Caruso to make his entrance, the little me had been routed and the big me was in command. After Caruso finished his aria, the audience rose to its feet, cheering and shouting bravo. A powerful force had been put into the person of Caruso. Only when he recognized that a weak force was holding it back and acted upon that knowledge did the stronger one come through. The same thing is true for all who perform before audiences. But a similar situation can arise with those who do not perform publicly. Something can come up which almost overcomes a person with panic, the most terrifying of human experiences. And regardless of what it happens to be, this same formula can be made to work to restore the senses and summon up the strength and ability to fight down the panic and attack the situation with good judgment and ability. Each of us is a combination of two forces. The one comprises all of our strength, talent, and abilities. The other is the cynic, the critic, the doubter which tries to bury us in a corner. One must win, and when it's the little cynic, it's because we don't know our own strength. A tiger is being forced to sit on a stool by a little man with a chair in his hand. It's worth thinking about, because certainly an experience like this comes to all of us at one time or another. Swift said, "Although men are accused of not knowing their own weakness, yet perhaps a few know their own strength. It is in men as in soils, where sometimes there is a vein of gold which the owner knows not of."
Dr. Roger Berkman of Houston, Texas, a real expert on people and why they function as they do, has said that we are as we see others. So if you're interested in a deep and truthful insight into yourself, you are as you tend to see other people. If you trust other people, you're a trustworthy person. If you love others, you're a lovable person. Dr. Berkman also has written that we are least tolerant of those negative traits in others that we ourselves possess. When we're suspicious of the intentions of others, it's because our own intentions are often not what we would want others to believe them to be. We create others in our own image. Another Dr. Berkman quotation. We create others in our own image. Soren Kierkegaard has written the majority of men are subjective towards themselves and objective towards all others. Terribly objective sometimes, but the real task is to be objective toward oneself and subjective towards all others. Our confidence in people and our doubt about them are closely related to our self-confidence and our self-doubt. Strength and tolerance are partners. Strength and tolerance are partners. I like that one. Really strong people are tolerant people. They're tolerant around children and their wives, with their fellow workers and subordinates, even with their superiors. Strength and tolerance go together. You can make a pretty accurate assessment of your true strength as a person by measuring your degree of tolerance. So how are you doing in the tolerance department? My friend Jack Davis provided me with a good idea in this department. Next time you meet someone who does not behave as you do, no matter what his age, color, creed, or class, instead of asking why he acts as he does, why not, just as a mental exercise, step outside yourself and find out why you act or react as you do? The tolerant person says to himself, when he sees someone doing or saying something that he doesn't understand, I wonder what his reason is for doing or saying that. There must be a reason there. And remember that we are least tolerant of those negative traits in others that we ourselves possess. I used to become furiously angry at drivers who would block the pedestrian crosswalk at intersections, until one day I found myself doing it. Sometimes it's difficult to see the oncoming traffic from behind the pedestrian walkway, and there's a tendency to pull out on it when there are no pedestrians. Then you're still stuck there when along comes a pedestrian who has then to walk around the front of your car. The teenager who burns rubber pulling away from a stop can't afford a new set of tires, but he wants very much to be noticed. It's his way of saying, please look at me. I'm driving a car. Not well, but I'm driving. Young people dress and wear their hair in the current fashion because they want to belong to the group. They don't want to be outcasts. We dress to please our own group the same way. Looking behind what people do and keeping in mind their rights will go a long way towards building tolerance. As Kierkegaard put it, the majority of men are subjective towards themselves and objective towards all others, terribly objective sometimes. But the real task is to be objective towards oneself and subjective toward all others. And here's something we should read or listen to once a day for the next 45 years. It was written back at the turn of the century by William George Jordan. He was editor of several magazines during his lifetime, including the Ladies' Home Journal and the Saturday Evening Post. He wrote, "Calmness is the rarest quality in human life. It is the poise of a great nature in harmony with itself and its ideals. It is the moral atmosphere of a life self-reliant and self-controlled. Calmness is singleness of purpose, absolute confidence, and conscious power ready to be focused in an instant to meet any crisis. The Sphinx is not a true type of calmness. Petrifaction is not calmness, it's death, the silencing of all the energies. While no one lives his life more fully, more intensely, and more consciously than the person who is calm. The fatalist is not calm. He's the coward slave of his environment, hopelessly surrendering to his present condition, recklessly indifferent to his future. He accepts his life as a rudderless ship drifting on the ocean of time. He has no compass, no chart, no known port to which he's sailing. His self-confessed inferiority to all nature is shown in his existence of constant surrender. It is not calmness. The person who is calm has his course in life clearly marked on his chart. His hand is ever on the helm. Storm, fog, night, tempest, danger, hidden reefs, he's prepared and ready for them. He's made calm and serene by the realization that in these crises of his voyage he needs a clear mind and a cool head. That he has nothing to do but do each day the best he can by the light he has. That he will never flinch nor falter for a moment. That though he may have to tack and leave his course for a time, he'll never drift. He'll get back into the true channel. He'll keep ever headed toward his harbor. When he will reach it, how he will reach it matters not to him. He rests in calmness, knowing he's done his best. When the worries and cares of the day fret you and begin to wear upon you and you chafe under their friction, be calm. Stop. Rest for a moment, and let calmness and peace assert themselves. If you let these irritating outside influences get the better of you, you're confessing your inferiority to them by permitting them to dominate you. When the tongue of malice and slander, the persecution of inferiority, tempt you to retaliate, when for an instant you forget yourself so far as to hunger for revenge, be calm. When the gray heron is pursued by its enemy, the eagle, it does not run to escape. It remains calm, takes a dignified stand, and waits quietly, facing the enemy unmoved. With the terrific force with which the eagle makes its attack, the boasted king of birds is often impaled and run through on the quiet, lance-like bill of the heron. No person in the world ever attempted to wrong another without being injured in return, some way, somehow, sometime. Remain calm. Now, although that was written at the turn of the century and in language that today might sound a bit affected and archaic, it's a good message. If ever there were a quality needed in the crisis-filled world of today, it's calmness, and the kind of clear thinking calmness produces. I wonder how improved our days would be if we would make it a point to go over that little message every morning. On the occasion of his 75th birthday, Mark Van Doren, the American writer, poet, critic, and educator, was interviewed by a reporter for Life magazine, and one of the things he said stuck in my mind. I've saved this. He said, "It takes courage to be happy." Now, in those 6 words, he said a great deal. Any person can wallow in misery and self-pity. It's easy to rail against the world and its injustices. Easier still to sit down and do nothing like the famous hound dog with its tail in the crack, but it takes courage to be happy. When he said it takes courage to be happy, he didn't mean happiness today or tomorrow or a week from next Thursday. He meant to be happy as a general, relatively constant way of living. To be a happy person as opposed to a generally unhappy person. And it does take courage, courage of a high order. The world is full, it seems, of the "it's too good to last" or "it's just my kind of luck" people who expect bad luck and rejection as confidently as they expect the sun to rise the next morning. They're people who were given bleak and disappointing starts in life. Tolstoy said man is meant for happiness, and this happiness is in him, in the satisfaction of the daily needs of his existence. And La Rochefoucauld said happiness is in the taste, and not in the things themselves. We're happy from possessing what we like, not from possessing what others like. Rudolph Flesch quotes Jane Austen, a passage that I think is very revealing. She wrote,
No temper could be more cheerful than hers, or possess in a greater degree that sanguine expectation of happiness, which is happiness itself. That sanguine expectation of happiness, which is happiness itself. It is in the expectation of happiness that much of happiness itself is found, and it takes courage to expect happiness. Balzac wrote, "All happiness depends on courage and work." I have had many periods of wretchedness, but with energy and above all with illusions, I pulled through them all. My old favorite, George Santa Anna, said happiness is the only sanction of life. Where happiness fails, existence remains a mad and lamentable experiment. Bertrand Russell put it well when he said, "Contempt for happiness is usually contempt for other people's happiness, and is an elegant disguise for hatred of the human race." The Chinese philosopher Lin Yutang said, "I've always been impressed by the fact that the most studiously avoided subject in Western philosophy is that of happiness." A French philosopher said much the same as did Marc Van Doren. He said, "To live, we must conquer incessantly. We must have the courage to be happy." We've all seen people seriously handicapped in one way or another who are wonderfully cheerful and happy people, and we've wondered how they do it. We've said to ourselves, "I don't think I could be happy if I had his or her affliction." These people are happy because they're courageous and because they don't like the alternative.
C.S. Lewis said, "Courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point, which means at the point of highest reality." In our modern world, with debate over a common sense of morality, we are faced with questions of right and wrong every day. It's not unusual to feel our virtues being tested. Mostly they're small things. But even when a firm system of beliefs are present, choices can be difficult. It has been said that courage is faith put into action. When a person has faith in himself, in his values, and in the worth of the goal being pursued, sometimes the simplest of acts can be the most courageous of acts. Courage is acting on what you are.
My old friend Dr. Harold Blake Walker of Evanston sent me something sometime back that I enjoyed tremendously, and I think he will too. He wrote, "We live by faith, or we do not live at all. Either we venture, or we vegetate. If we venture, we do so by faith, simply because we cannot know the end of anything at its beginning. We risk marriage on faith, or we stay single. We prepare for a profession by faith, or we give up before we start. By faith, we move mountains or opposition, or we're stopped by molehills. Faith, however, is not often tranquil and steady. It ebbs and flows like the tides of the restless sea. Normally, like Browning's bishop, we are forever exchanging a life of doubt, diversified by faith, for one of faith, diversified by doubt. Yesterday, we began the day with confident hope, with trust in its promise. Last night, perhaps after a trying and troublesome day, we were beset by doubt and anxiety. We grope and fumble in search of certainty, wishing we could escape the doubts that haunt us. The peril is that we shall cease groping on through our doubts and live only on our negations. What we need, you and I, is faith strong enough to bear the burden of our doubts. No man ever drilled an oil well without being troubled by misgivings as the drill chewed downward toward producing structures, but only a fool would cease drilling halfway to the hoped-for pool. It was William Morris, the painter, who wrote, "I tell you, it's no joke to paint a portrait. Into the painting of every picture that's worth anything there comes a period of doubt and despair. The artist, however, goes on with his work beyond his doubt to creative achievement. Faith enough to carry our doubts. It's enough. Perhaps it's all we can manage when fears assail and doubts annoy. Maybe we can do no more than grope on through our uncertainties, pursuing the enterprises of our lives in the grim trust that the end will justify the struggle. If, despite our gnawing doubts, we can muster faith enough to take a single step on the road to where we're going, we are on the way to creative achievement. Every triumph of the human spirit begins with one step taken in faith. The single step is the small handle to great matters. No man or woman ever won a worthy triumph without faith to keep on and on, always able to last at least 5 minutes longer. There's one further thing to be said, namely that worthy triumphs cannot be won without faith enough to maintain our integrity. One of the ultimate tests of faith is our capacity to go on believing that somehow the right is the right, even when right is on the scaffold and wrong seems to be on the throne. All of the great ventures of our lives require faith enough to bear the burden of our doubts, so that we're able to take the first step in the direction in which we wish to go. Enough of faith to keep on going through struggle and strain, and to maintain integrity on the way. I like that. Yes, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And we need to exchange a life of doubt, diversified by faith, to a life of faith, diversified by doubt.
Let me ask you a rather personal question. What do you believe in? Now, it sometimes seems that there's so much doubt, fear, and cynicism, so much tongue-in-cheek and wise guy elbow rib poking that we've come to the place where people don't believe in anything anymore. People doubt their own capacity for judgment, for knowing what's right or wrong. They wait to see what others do or say before they'll express an opinion of their own. So, what do you believe in? Now, this is not an unimportant question. It's as vital that each of us decides exactly what he does believe in as anything else, and I'll tell you why. It is what you believe in that will determine the course of your life, what happens to you, and your ultimate destiny. The great truth, as you believe, so shall it be done unto you, seems to go almost unnoticed today. But that's the way it works. What you believe in is what will happen to you. For belief is faith, and faith is still the greatest power on earth. A young medical student was being examined by a board of distinguished doctors to determine whether or not he would receive his license to practice. They asked him, "Why do you want to be a physician?" And he replied, "I've known I was going to be a doctor for as long as I can remember. There's simply no question about it. I'm going to be a practicing physician and a good one." He didn't beg the question. He told them he was going to be a doctor. They had no choice in the matter. The difference between faith and wanting or wishing is that with faith we know what's going to be. With the others, we're only hoping. It's what we believe that makes us the kind of people we are. The greater our faith, the greater we become. People who let others do their thinking for them, who will not venture forth an opinion on any subject until they're sure that what they say will be met with approval and acceptance, do not believe. They conform to a picture of what they think others want them to be like. They are chameleons, ready to take on any hue their surroundings demand. They have no deep anchors of belief, and so drift aimlessly on the surface of life. So when I ask you, what do you believe in, I meant, what do you have faith in? What would you be willing to risk everything you have on because of the certainty of your belief? If a person believes he's not much of a person, that's what he is. If he believes that he has value, that there's no other person on earth exactly like him, and that he has an important contribution to make, and that he can reach the goals he sets for himself, these things are then true and will come to pass. People remain where they are because they believe that's where they ought to be, and they rise to new heights of achievement and ability because they believe they will. The greatest teachers who ever lived, men whose minds soared far above those of their times and whom we still read and believe, said that according to our faith will it be done unto us. And that, my friend, is the way it works. There are no arguments, no exceptions, no hair-splitting. What do you believe? Then that's what you are. The worst thing that can happen to a person is to lose his belief in something great and important to him. For with belief gone, faith is gone. And when that's gone, there isn't anything left. The name of this book is Edward R. Murrow's book, This I Believe. I talked about this once before on this program, and it's quite a thing. Edward R. Murrow writes in the foreword of the book, he says, in the autumn of 1940, when Britain stood alone, when the bombers came at dusk each evening and went away at dawn, I observed a sign on a church just off the East India Dock Road. It was crudely lettered, and it read, "If your knees knock, kneel on them." I quoted that sign in a broadcast to America that night, but didn't fully understand it. For even in those dark days, I could observe no more kneeling or knocking knees than at the time of Munich. The imminence of disaster brought no spiritual revival, and yet at a time when most men, save Englishmen, despaired of England's life, there was a steadiness, a confidence, and determination that must have been based on something other than a lack of imagination. We all remember the almost unbelievably gallant stand made by Great Britain when she was threatened with extermination. As the months wore on and the nights lengthened and the casualty list mounted, I became more concerned to try to understand what sustained this island people. What belief or what mythology caused them to stand so steady in their shoes? In part, it was ignorance of their own weakness. In part, it was a reluctance to appear obvious by expressing doubt as to the ultimate outcome. But at bottom, this calm confidence stemmed from a belief that what they were defending was good. That Englishmen had devised a system of regulating the relationship between the individual and the state which was superior to all others and which would survive even though cold military calculations concluded that the state was doomed. Well, there was little logic in this British belief. Unconsciously, they dug deep into their history and felt that Drake and Raleigh and Frobisher and Hawkins and Cromwell and all the rest were looking down at them, and they were obliged to appear worthy in the eyes of their ancestors. But above everything else, they believed. They believed not only in themselves, but that they were fighting against evil things, and the fight was worthwhile. No democracy has been nearer the fire and survived than was Britain in that long winter. And one reason for survival was that the nation did not betray the things in which it believed. After Italy entered the war, one of the few murder cases to reach the law lords on appeal was decided. An Italian citizen, long-time resident in Britain, had been convicted by the lower courts of killing a British seaman one night, and the High Court reversed the verdict and set the Italian free. And in the pubs and in Parliament and on the buses and in newspaper offices, this was regarded as the normal functioning of British justice. At a time when German bombers were coming through in the daylight over London, when the Germans were expected on the beaches the first foggy morning, the House of Commons, which might have been destroyed with all its members by one well-placed enemy bomb, devoted 2 days to discussing the conditions under which enemy aliens were being held on the Isle of Man. For the House of Commons was determined that though the island fell, there would be nothing resembling concentration camps in Britain, and the rights under law of enemy aliens would not be abused. That's what the British collectively believed. Sometimes it appears that there's a hidden guide someplace whose duty it is to test men and women through all sorts of discouraging experiences. And those who sort of pick themselves up after getting knocked down and keep on trying arrive. It's an uncanny thing, but it works. And this hidden guide lets no one enjoy great achievement without passing the persistence test, it seems. And those who can't take it simply don't make the grade. And those who can take it are bountifully rewarded for their persistence. They receive as their compensation whatever goal they're pursuing, and that's not all. Because they receive something infinitely more important than material compensation, although they get that. But they get the knowledge that every failure brings with it the seed of an equivalent advantage. There are exceptions to this rule. A few people know from experience the soundness of persistence. They're the ones who have not accepted defeat as being anything more than temporary. They're the ones whose desires are so persistently applied that defeat is finally changed into victory. I was reading just the other day about the great Newt Rockne of Notre Dame, who believed and applied this very thing we're talking about. How he had a blood clot in one leg. And his doctors told him that if that blood clot traveled through his bloodstream to his heart, it would kill him. But the Notre Dame team were playing far from home that day, and he insisted on being taken to the game in a stretcher. So they flew him or put him on the train or something. They got him to where the game was to be played. And they took him down to the dressing room where his football players were getting ready for the game. And the perspiration was running down his face, and he was in terrible pain, and he propped himself up on his elbows with a tremendous effort. And he said, "This team you're playing today beat us last year." And he said, "I want you to get out there and win." And it was then that he said, "The team that won't be beat can't be beat." And then he fell back on his stretcher, out of breath and suffering terribly, and the team went out and won the game, and they never lost another game as long as Knute Rockne was alive. Because when they saw that the type of courage that he could develop, how persistently he fought to win, even though he was flat on his back, well, it made giants out of men. And people who stand on the sidelines of life see the overwhelmingly large number who go down in defeat never to rise again. They see the few who take the punishment of defeat as an urge to greater effort. And these, fortunately, never learn to accept life's reverse gear. But what we don't see, what most of us never suspect of existing, is the silent but irresistible power which comes to the rescue of those who fight on in the face of discouragement. Now, if we speak of this power at all, we call it persistence and let it go at that. One thing we all know, if one does not possess persistence, one cannot achieve any noteworthy success in any calling.
The great Robert Louis Stevenson has long been one of my favorites, not just as a great writer, but as a man as well. Plagued by a frail body and poor health, destined to die at just 44 years of age, he put more living, more travel, and more work and talent into his short time here on Earth than a million so-called average men. The author of Treasure Island, Kidnapped, Dr. Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde, Stevenson once wrote in a small essay, "As courage and intelligence are the two qualities best worth a good man's cultivation." That's good, isn't it? Courage and intelligence. So it is the first part of intelligence to recognize our precarious estate in life, and the first part of courage to be not at all abashed before the fact. A frank and somewhat headlong carriage, not looking too anxiously before, not dallying in maudlin regret over the past, stamps the man who is well armored for this world, and not only well armored for himself, but a good friend and a good citizen to boot. We do not go to cowards for tender dealings. There is nothing so cruel as panic. The man who has least fear for his own carcass has most time to consider others. So soon as prudence has begun to show up in the brain like a dismal fungus, it finds its first expression in a paralysis of generous acts. The victim begins to shrink spiritually. He develops a fancy for parlors with a regulated temperature. The care of one important body and soul becomes so engrossing that all the noises of the outer world begin to come thin and faint into the parlor with the regulated temperature. He makes some important points in those few words, don't you think? The first and most important being that the two qualities best worth a good man or woman's cultivation are courage and intelligence, and that it's the first part of intelligence to recognize our very precarious estate in life, and thus not play it too safely. There's no way to win that game. Tiptoeing through life won't change the final outcome. As soon as too much prudence begins to show up in the brain like a dismal fungus, it finds its first expression in a paralysis of generous acts. The victim begins to shrink and so on. Some people worry so much about the future that they fail entirely to enjoy today. William Lyon Phelps once pointed out that we look backward too much and we look forward too much. Thus we miss the passing moment. In our regrets and apprehensions, we miss the only eternity of which man can be absolutely sure, the eternal present, for it is always now. The fear of life is the favorite disease of the 20th century. Too many people are afraid of tomorrow. Their happiness is poisoned by a phantom. Many are afraid of old age, forgetting that even if they should lose their bodily vigor, weakness itself may minister to the development of the mind and spirit. Instead of chagrin over the past and alarm over the future, suppose we consider our opportunity. As Emerson put it, write in on your heart that every day is the best day in the year. No man has earned anything rightly until he knows that every day is doomsday. Today is a king in disguise. A small lesson from three great minds, Stevenson, Phelps, and Emerson. Courage and intelligence are the two qualities best worth our cultivation, and don't play it too safe. The man who has least fear for his own carcass has most time to consider others. One of the most interesting things about people is that they can and do change for the better. A person who was once a criminal becomes a model citizen. Another person kicks a drug habit and begins living a life of responsibility and contribution. And for every one of those, there are millions who, over a span of years, have become substantially better as persons, who are kinder, more honest, more conscientious about their responsibilities, and so on. But just how does a person improve, and why? In his column, Strictly Personal, Sidney J. Harris once wrote, "It is not an act of intellect that makes people change themselves for the better, not a matter of insight, but an act of the will. For intelligence without courage is as static as courage without intelligence is rash." It is not an act of intellect that makes people change themselves for the better, but an act of the will. For intelligence without courage is as static as courage without intelligence is rash. It is intelligence with courage that results in the necessary act of the will we need in order to bring about constructive change in ourselves. The person who breaks a bad and destructive habit does so by an act of the will. His intelligence tells him that he has a bad habit. It may be a work habit, it may be a study habit or non-study habit, it might be a drug habit. It can be any sort of non-productive or destructive habit. Any person with a bad habit knows about it. His intelligence informs him. But changing a bad habit into a good one, or at least getting rid of the bad one, takes an act of the will over a sufficiently long period of time to render it impotent. After a period of time, a surprisingly short time for most habits, it no longer clamors for attention. It fades away and finally disappears. Now the will can be turned off. The habit is gone. But it's turning on the will to undertake such a task that takes courage. Pericles said, "The secret of happiness is freedom, and the secret of freedom, courage." When we rid ourselves of unproductive and debilitating habits, we literally free ourselves to that degree. The more bad habits we can get rid of, the freer we become, the happier we become, the better our self-image becomes. The secret of happiness is freedom. But the secret of freedom, courage. For intelligence without courage, as Sid Harris wrote, is as static as courage without intelligence is rash. Habits that make us happy we should keep. Habits that lead to unhappiness and illness we should try to muster the courage to end. It's surprising how easily a bad habit is routed once it's faced with courage. As Emerson said, "What a new face courage puts on everything." Anyway, I think that's how people bring about constructive change in themselves and their lives. They do it through courage, based on intelligence, resulting in an act of will.
Viktor Frankl, a distinguished psychiatrist and survivor of unspeakable atrocities at the hands of the Nazis in one of their concentration camps, says the last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. In fact, it was learning this that kept him free and alive even while he was languishing in a death camp. Let me give you that one again. It's so important. The last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Attitude, being an inner thing, can keep us free, even fairly cheerful, regardless of the environment in which circumstances may have placed us. The ancient philosophers had discovered this fact, but it seems that each maturing person must rediscover it for himself if he's to find his own brand of freedom. Now, Dr. Frankl also wrote, "Fear makes come true that which one is afraid of." Now, even if it only comes true in the imagination, we must experience the tortures of that which we fear, tortures often as not worse than those if what we feared actually came to pass physically in our lives. It's why the old line, "A coward dies 1,000 deaths, a brave man dies but once," is really true. Fear makes come true that which one is afraid of. If fear of something is held long enough, it may well bring on that which we fear, but it really doesn't make much difference because experiencing the fear
is the same thing. That is, as far as our mind and body are concerned, it's actually happening over and over again, doing its inevitable damage to our physical bodies. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Fear is ignorance." Whenever we're afraid of something, I don't mean the perfectly natural, normal fears that work to keep us alive, but the gnawing, unreasoning, illogical, and neurotic fear of something. It's only because we don't know the real truth about it. If we did, the fear would vanish. That would include a neurotic fear of death, the fear that we are not liked or loved, and so forth. I think the thing to remember here is that when we fear something, it takes its toll on our mind and body just as if that which we fear had in fact come to pass. And we can bring to pass that which we fear, as Dr. Frankl said. But how does a person change an attitude of fear? Well, Dr. William Glasser, whom I'm very honored to number among my good friends, Dr. William Glasser, the distinguished psychiatrist and author of Reality Therapy and Schools Without Failure, says, if you want to change attitudes, start with a change in behavior. In other words, begin to act the part as well as you can of the person you would rather be, the person you most want to become. Gradually, the old fearful person will fade away. Dr. Frankl learned that by controlling his attitude, the concentration camp fell away. His mind was free to roam where he wanted it to roam, think about what he wanted it to think about. It was as free as the birds, freer, really, for it could fly to the ends of the earth, to the ends of imagination in an instant. And so can yours, and so can mine. The last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. We can let circumstances rule us, or we can take charge and rule our lives from within.
Just as I was boarding my plane in Sydney, Australia to return to the United States, my old friend Rolly Leopold of Melbourne handed me a small booklet. He said, "I think you'll enjoy reading this on the flight home." The title of the little book was The Gift of Courage, written by Paul Spiker. Let me read a part to you. If you could have as a gift your dearest wish fulfilled, the wish that lies closest to your heart, the thing that you want most in the world, what would you choose? $1 million? Abounding health? A magic solution to business worries? A contented mind? A devoted family? The privilege of traveling only on the hilltops in the morning sun? Escape from the ills of life which are common to all? What gift would be more worthy of you than the fulfillment of an idle daydream? What one thing would help you win through the problems you face today and may face again tomorrow? What gift would enable you to enjoy because you've fought, to rest because you've labored, to reap because you've sown? There is such a gift within your grasp, a gift which you yourself can give yourself, a gift which will bring all the things for which you secretly long, a gift which, like magic, will help clear the troubled roadway ahead and set your feet upon the pathway to real happiness. And that is the gift of courage. Emerson wrote, "What a new face courage puts on everything," and no truer statement was ever written. Wherever it appears, courage changes things for the better. Sometimes it's the courage to be silent when a word or phrase leaps to our mind. It's often the courage to get up on a cold, miserable morning when it's the last thing in the world you want to do, to go to work. It's the courage to do what needs to be done when it should be done. It's the courage to discharge a person who should be discharged, and who will probably be better off because of it. And it's the courage to follow the silent voice within you when it means going against the crowd, or speaking out when you know what you're going to say will be unpopular with your listeners. It's the courage to stay with something long enough to succeed at it, realizing that it usually takes 2, 3, or 4 times as long to succeed as you first thought or hoped. There's such a gift within your grasp, a gift which, like magic, will help clear the troubled roadway ahead and set your feet upon the pathway to real happiness. And that is the gift of courage. Do you know what form of punishment people dread more than any other? I'll bet you'd never guess. Well, it's laughter. That's right. As a wise man once wrote, the deepest principle of human nature is the craving to be appreciated, and the exact opposite of being appreciated is to be laughed at. In fact, among the Eskimos, laughter is the only punishment for thieves. If a person is found to be a thief, all the Eskimos in the village laugh at him whenever they see him. As a result, there's very little stealing among Eskimos. This is the reason youngsters in school like to dress alike. I drove by a corner the other day where 4 or 5 girls who looked to be of high school age were waiting for a school bus. They were all wearing identical coats. It appeared at first that they belonged to some kind of an organization which demanded that its members wear uniforms. Even though dressing like everyone else has the effect of removing our individuality and causing us to disappear by blending in with the crowd, it's much better than taking the risk of being laughed at. And since children will laugh more quickly at an individual who's different than adults will, children are much more conscious of wearing what all the other kids are wearing. Laughter is the severest form of criticism, and the fear of criticism keeps us from doing a lot of things. It keeps us from doing a lot of things we should not do, and that's good, as laughter keeps Eskimos from stealing. But it also keeps us from doing a lot of things that we would be better off doing. It is one of the enormous pressures of environment. Take the worker, for example, who avoids doing an outstanding and conscientious job because of the fear that his more cynical associates might laugh at him. Now here, the fear of criticism in the form of laughter could shape a man's life and keep him from the goals and achievements he might otherwise reach, if he weren't so conscious of how his actions will look to others. It is here that a better understanding of what is right and wrong can overcome a person's fear of criticism. Frequently, being right and doing what is right can bring down upon us criticism and derision while going along with things, even though we know they're wrong, will keep us in good with the crowd and our associates. Now, it's right here that the men are separated from the boys. When our desire to belong to our crowd is more important to us than to stand up for what we know to be right, we have to admit that we are lacking in the 2 most important attributes of a human being, courage and maturity. Winston Churchill once said that courage is the finest quality because it guarantees all the others. And if there's one vital aspect of living successfully that we should get across to our youngsters, it's this. If our kids want to dress like all the other kids in their class, fine, that's normal. We were the same way when we were kids. But they should be told why they want to look like all the other kids in school, that it's their natural desire to belong, to be liked. And while that's perfectly all right, they should keep constantly in mind that it should end there, and that it's also right that we should want to grow into individuals with individual goals, individual thinking, individual action, and that we'll be happiest if we will do our work as best we possibly can, even though it may be the fashion for most of the rest to slide along as easily as possible. F.D. Huntington wrote, "Conduct is the great profession. Behavior is the perpetual revealing of us. What a man does tells us what he is."
Here's a question for you. If you came across a plank on the ground, say the plank is 12 feet long, 4 inches thick, and 12 inches wide, you'd have no trouble walking from one end of it to the other. Now let's stretch that same plank between 2 buildings that are 100 feet tall. With nothing under you except 100 feet of air and a street down below, would you walk the same plank now? Same plank, same distance, but a different, more demanding situation. And let's say you're telling your family, gathered around the dinner table, about something in which you believe very much, your philosophy of living, for example. Now change the setting to an auditorium. You're standing on the stage before 1,000 people. How would you feel about making the talk now? You'd be saying the same thing in the same way, but the setting has changed. Walking the plank and making the talk are easy for you in one set of circumstances. Without changing your performance at all, but changing the setting, a new element is introduced, one that alters your mental attitude considerably, and that element is fear. Fear of what might happen. Fear of what might happen under this new set of circumstances turns 2 perfectly simple and natural performances into occasions of great risk, so great that you might refuse to do either of them. Since you know perfectly well that you can walk the plank if it's on the ground, it stands to reason you can walk the same plank anywhere else. If you can make a talk under one set of circumstances, you can make the same talk, and just as interesting, under any other conditions. But fear seems to keep us from taking a formula we know will work under one condition and applying it to a larger situation. The fear of what might happen holds us back. We permit ourselves to fail by default rather than run the risk of failing as a result of having made the effort to succeed. Now, it's not important that we walk the length of the plank, whether it's on the ground or high in the air, and it's not too important whether we make our little talk to the people in the auditorium, perhaps. But how many things are there at which we succeed, at which we could be successful on a much larger scale? It's all a mental game. We play the whole thing out in our minds, and it's there, not in actual practice, that we win or lose. No one can even guess how much is lost by the so-called average person, simply because he fears to make the attempt. His fear of failure in his own eyes and in the eyes of his family and friends, and the possible loss of a small stake, raises a formidable wall between his reality and his dream. So he contents himself to peek at his dream over the top of the wall and wait. Wait until conditions are better, or Uncle Charlie dies and leaves all that money. But waiting just seems to make the wall grow higher. Conditions seem to remain about the same, and Uncle Charlie's going to outlive everybody in the family. And finally, even on tiptoes, you can't see over the wall anymore. It's too high now, and it's too late. Well, so what? It was just an idea, a dream. Yes, that's all it was, just an idea, a dream, but what could it have been? What might it have been if you'd scrambled over that wall before it got too high?
You remember when Robert N. Manry, a copy editor at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, sailed from the United States to England in a 13.5-foot sailboat? 3,200 miles across the North Atlantic in a boat so small you'd hesitate to take it out on Lake Michigan and Long Island Sound as small craft warnings were flying. For 78 days, Manry and his tiny 36-year-old sailboat battled one of the toughest stretches of salt water on Earth. Gales blew the boat on its side. Manry tried to nap during the day and sailed at night so that he could try to avoid being run down and chopped into kindling and hamburger by great ocean-going steamers. On several occasions, he was washed over the side in heavy seas, and each time he'd haul himself back aboard by a lifeline he kept tied about himself and to his boat. He suffered terrible hallucinations, the result of having to take so many pep pills to stay awake during the long nights. Why? What made him do it? It wasn't publicity. He went about the whole thing so quietly, practically no one even knew what he was up to. He thought no one would pay any attention to him, and that was fine with him. The reason was that he had dreamed of sailing the Atlantic ever since he'd been a small boy. He bought the dinky old boat for $250. He completely rebuilt it, taught himself navigation, and practiced long-distance sailing on Lake Erie. He told his wife the real reason for his embarking on so incredible a journey and so vulnerable a craft. He said to her, "There's a time when one must decide either to risk everything to fulfill one's dreams or sit for the rest of one's life in the backyard." That's why Mr. Manry went sailing over the mountains of deep water in a boat only about twice the size of your bathtub. That's why he sat in his tiny open cockpit and weathered storms that caused the passengers to clear the weather decks of great ocean liners. He was fulfilling a dream he'd carried in his heart since he'd been a small boy. Well, offers for books and magazine articles poured in on him. Cleveland gave him a hero's welcome, as did the 20,000 people who wildly cheered the successful end of his voyage when he arrived in Falmouth, England. It's been proposed to Congress that Manry's boat, Tinkerbell, be placed in the Smithsonian Institution alongside Charles Lindbergh's plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. Courage. The courage to finally take one's life in one's own hands and go after the big dream has a way of making dreams come true. It seems to open hidden doorways from which good things begin to point the way. It's never easy, and the good results come only after we've made the journey in our own way. For Manry, at 47 years of age, it was sailing 3,000 miles of the North Atlantic. Each of us must make his own voyage to fulfillment in his own way. Or sit in the backyard.
One of the nicest and most talented people this country ever produced was James Thurber. His writings and cartoons interested and delighted an entire generation, and they'll continue to live in the years ahead. I had the interesting experience of listening to an interview that had been taped some years before James Thurber died, and for the first time discovered why he was blind. When asked about his blindness, he said that he had been shot in the eye with an arrow in 1902 when he was just 8 years old. The other eye, to his and everyone else's dismay, slowly developed sympathetic ophthalmia and gradually went blind also. The amazing thing about it was that for many years James Thurber continued to see with one eye, even though the best eye doctors in the country told him he was completely blind. He didn't know how he could do this, and when asked, he could only reply that he didn't know how he could see, but he could. He also said that if the eye in which he had been shot had received prompt and professional attention, it could have been saved, and along with it his vision for life. James Thurber never permitted his handicap to bother him or anyone else. He was cheerful, talented, and hard-working, and he had many thousands of friends. James Thurber was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1894. He became the managing editor of the New Yorker magazine, to which he contributed so many of his humorous articles and cartoons. He was a gifted and highly skilled writer, and permitted nothing to appear in print that he had not first edited and re-edited until it was as good as he could make it. He was probably best known to the general public for his character Walter Mitty, the shy, wife-dominated common man who found release from his humdrum existence in fanciful daydreams of performing heroic acts. In his imaginings, he was the captain of a speeding hydroplane, getting passengers through the storm, or a highly skilled surgeon saving the life everyone else had given up for lost. This particular story got wide circulation and was made into a motion picture. The next time you visit your library or bookstore, ask for something by James Thurber. It's fine writing, and it'll make you laugh. If you still haven't read his story, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, do so by all means. It'll make you laugh at yourself, which is the healthiest kind of laughter. And it was written by a great person who saw humor and interest in almost everything, even though he was blind. James Thurber. Colton wrote, "Times of general calamity and confusion have ever been productive of the greatest minds. The purest ore is produced from the hottest furnace, and the brightest thunderbolt is elicited from the darkest storms."
Here's a line worth remembering. It was written by Balzac. By resorting to self-resignation, the unfortunate consummate their misfortune. There's a world of truth and a world of unnecessary suffering in that statement. The only thing that can keep misfortune hanging around is self-resignation, giving up. Makes you wonder how many thousands, perhaps millions, of fine people stay on the bottom of the pile because they've formed the habit of saying, well, that's the way things are, or that's the way the old ball bounces. Now, that would be all right for cows and pigs. They have to take life as it comes, but it's the very thing a person does not have to do. If things are going badly for him, he can change things and cause them to become good. If he isn't making enough money, he can find ways of earning more. If he doesn't like his neighborhood, he can move. If he doesn't like his job, he can quit. If he doesn't like being ignorant, he can get an education. He can, as a matter of fact, do anything he wants to do. But as a rule, he doesn't know this. So he shrugs his shoulders, gets a sad look on his face, stands still, does nothing, and says, well, that's the way it is. If everybody had said that from the very beginning, we'd still be running around without any clothes on, throwing rocks at each other. Let's go back to Balzac's little epigram. He said, by resorting to self-resignation, the unfortunate consummate their misfortune. In other words, by wallowing in self-resignation, the unfortunate cause a bad situation to get worse and stay there. Every human being on Earth is going to suffer a setback from time to time. Setbacks are a part of life, as are fires, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes. But fortunately, the human being is a builder and a rebuilder, and he rebuilds better than he builds. He doesn't sit in the aftermath of the storm and resign himself. He builds better next time, so the damage won't be as great or even hurt him at all. That's how skyscrapers evolved from mud huts. Outside of death and taxes, we don't have to resign ourselves to anything. And if the situation is bad, unfortunate or unpleasant, self-resignation, as Balzac pointed out, will only consummate the fact. To my mind, there are few people more to be pitied than the sighers, resigners, and shoulder-shruggers, those who would rather complain than think, who would rather bleat than take action, who would rather ask for help than help themselves. If you know people like that, it's a good idea to keep away from them unless you're very strong. They'll infect you with their virus, splice you with their mud, and they're almost impossible to help. Like rag dolls, they'll flop right back down again the minute you turn loose of them. Just make sure you don't adopt any of their fatal habits. When things start to look bleak, remember that you have the power to change them, and that you're the only creature on Earth with that kind of power. Build better and stronger next time. Do something about it. Change a bad situation into a good one. Don't ask how. Figure it out for yourself. It's been written that it's often better to have a great deal of harm rather than a little happen to one. A great deal of harm may rouse you to remove what a little harm will only accustom you to endure.
This is a story about what can happen to a loser. When he was a little boy, the other kids called him Sparky, after a comic strip horse named Sparkplug. Sparky never did shake that nickname. School was all but impossible for Sparky. He failed every subject in the 8th grade. Every subject. He flunked physics in high school, received a flat 0 for the course. He distinguished himself as the worst physics student in his school's history. He also flunked Latin, and algebra, and English. He didn't do much better in sports. Although he did manage to make the school's golf team, he promptly lost the only important match of the year. There was a consolation match, however, and Sparky lost that, too. Throughout his youth, Sparky was awkward socially. He was not actually disliked by the other youngsters. No one cared that much. He was astonished if a classmate ever said hello to him outside school hours. No way to tell how he might have done at dating. In high school, Sparky never once asked a girl out. He was too afraid of being turned down. Sparky was a loser. He, his classmates, everyone knew it, so he rolled with it. Sparky made up his mind early in life that if things were meant to work out, they would. Otherwise, he would content himself with what appeared to be his inevitable mediocrity. But there was one thing that was important to Sparky: drawing. He was proud of his own artwork. Of course, no one else appreciated it. In his senior year of high school, he submitted some cartoons to the editors of his class yearbook. Almost predictably, they were rejected. Despite this particularly painful rejection, Sparky was so convinced of his artistic ability that he decided to become a professional artist. Upon graduating from high school, he wrote a letter to Walt Disney Studios. He was told to send some samples of his artwork, and the subject matter for a cartoon was suggested. Sparky drew the proposed cartoon. He spent a great deal of time on it and the other drawings. Finally, the reply from Disney Studios came. He was rejected once again. Another loss for the loser. So Sparky wrote his own autobiography in cartoons. He described his childhood self, the little boy loser, the chronic underachiever, in a cartoon character that was soon to become famous all over the world. For the boy who failed every subject in the 8th grade and whose work was rejected again and again was Sparky Charles Monroe Schultz. He created the Peanuts comic strip and the little cartoon boy whose kite would never fly, Charlie Brown. Winston Churchill said it all in a speech he once made during World War II. Never give up. Never give up. Never, never give up.
William Ellery Channing wrote something a long time ago that I like. He called it Man's Will to Rise. It goes like this. You may see thousands with every opportunity of improvement which wealth can gather, with teachers, libraries, and apparatus bringing nothing to pass, and others with few helps doing wonders, and simply because the latter are in earnest and the former not. A man in earnest finds means, or if he cannot find them, creates them. A vigorous purpose makes much out of little, breathes power into weak instruments, disarms difficulties, and even turns them into assistances. Every condition has means of progress, if we have spirit enough to use them. The truth that progress is the very end of our being must not be received as a tradition, but comprehended and felt as a reality. A man is to cultivate himself because he is a man. He's to start with the conviction that there's something greater within him than in the whole material creation, than in all the worlds which press on the eye and ear, and that inward improvements have a worth and dignity in themselves, quite distinct from the power they give our outward things. Undoubtedly a man is to labor to better his conditions, but first to better himself. Difficulties are meant to rouse, not discourage. The human spirit is to grow strong by conflict, and how much it has already overcome. What mountains of difficulty has it cleared? And with all this experience, shall we say that the progress of men is to be despaired of? You cannot, without guilt and disgrace, stop where you are. The past and the present call you on to advance. Let what you have gained be an impulse to something higher. Your nature is too great to be crushed. If you will, you can rise. No power in society, no hardship in your condition can depress you, keep you down in knowledge, power, virtue, influence, but by your own consent. The words of William Channing. But by your own consent, there's the key. You are today what you have consented to be. You'll be tomorrow and the day after and next year and 10 years from now what you will consent to be. The decision is yours for you and mine for me, and his and hers for every human being on the face of the earth. Understanding this brings reality into the way we look at the world and the people in it. Boris Pasternak was free in a nation enslaved by communism. And in our own free world, there are millions of slaves who do not know that personal freedom is an inner thing. Our Constitution guarantees our freedom, but it cannot be enforced. That's left to us, to you and me. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." And he was in a position to know. He was a Roman slave. The person who has mastered himself has mastered his world and can mold it into any shape he will. Knowing the truth is freedom, and all else is a prison. J.S. Mill wrote, "The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts